Awesome. All right. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming today. Really excited for today's talk. We have Dr. Travis Rector from the University of Alaska, Anchorage. Dr. Rector does work on AGN and star formation more recently, but today he'll be talking about our role as astronomers and how we can address climate change. Travis is currently the chair of sustainability at AAS and has been a part of that committee for a few years now and has a lot of experience thinking about how or helping astronomers address climate change and outreach talks or in other ways. And so, yeah, so that's what we'll hear about today. I'm really excited to have you here. So go ahead, take it away, Travis.
Okay. Thank you, Ashley. I appreciate the introduction and thank you all for coming. Needless to say, if you have any questions along the way, don't hesitate to ask. You can just put them in the chat or raise your hand or do whatever we do here in the Zoom land. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk with you about the different things that astronomers can do to help address the climate crisis that we're facing. As Ashley mentioned, I'm a professor at the University of Alaska in Anchorage, but I'm also the chair of the Sustainability Committee for the AAS, and I'm also leading a task force on how to address climate change. And finally, I'll mention I'm part of a group called Astronomers for Planet Earth, and I'll share you more information about that group at the end of my talk. So there's three key points that I'd like for you to take away from my talk today. The first is that astronomy is contributing to climate change, and I'll talk about the ways that we are. We're also being affected by climate change, but the good news is that astronomers are in an excellent position to help people understand the issue of climate change and the solutions that we can adopt to address the problem. So often when I talk about astronomers engaging in climate change communication, people often want to know, why should we do it? Shouldn't we just leave this to climate scientists or other people who are working in the field? Often people feel like this is not our role to play. But one of the things I'd like to convince you of is that astronomers actually have a very important perspective that we bring to the table that's important when people talk about climate change. Now, one thing that's helpful for us as astronomers is that we have no skin in the game. One of the biggest problems that climate scientists themselves have talking about climate issues is they're often accused of being in it for the money. And while that's clearly not true, as astronomers, we can say that we are not involved in climate research. We don't receive funding for that. And we're simply using our knowledge of science to explain the climate issue. Another thing that's important is that we reach a lot of people. There's about 300,000 people who take an introductory astronomy class every year at a US institution. And for many of those students, that is the last formal science education they'll ever get. We also reach people through the public talks that we do in planetariums and informal science centers like museums. And these are all opportunities for us to talk about the climate issue. And then finally, it's very important that astronomers share our perspective on the climate issue. And so, for example, there's what's known as the overview effect, which is the perspective that astronauts get when they go out into space. And there's a lot of really great quotes from the Apollo astronauts who went out to the moon and saw the Earth from a distance. And so these are steely-eyed missile men, test pilots, not really the most soft and mushy guys. And they all had profound feelings on what it meant for them to see the Earth from afar. So Neil Armstrong described the Earth as a tiny pea out in space. Alan Shepard said that when he saw the Earth from the surface of the moon, it literally brought him to tears. And perhaps my favorite quote is from James Irwin, who said that when he saw the Earth from afar, it changed who he was. It changed his perspective. And while unfortunately, we don't actually get to go into space, astronomers share the same perspective that astronauts do in understanding the climate issue. And so the phrase you've all heard that there is no planet B, that is, of course, an astronomer perspective. Now, another thing that's important to know is that there's actually a lot of misconceptions related to astronomy that do affect people's perception of the climate crisis. And perhaps the biggest example of that is exoplanets. Last week, JPL released an announcement that they had discovered, confirmed the 5,000th exoplanet. Now, unfortunately, when we talk about exoplanets, we use phrases like Earth-like, or we talk about how a planet is in the habitable zone. And we know what those words mean, but unfortunately for the public, it gives an impression that there are all these worlds out there that maybe we could go and live on if things get bad here on Earth. And so one of the things that's very important for us as astronomers is to convey that that's not reality, that the only option we have is to stay here on Earth and to keep it habitable for us and the life forms here. So what I'd like to do is talk about the things that we can do as astronomers to talk about climate issues. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that in astronomy, we don't have a lot of experience and practice talking about controversial issues. In general, people like astronomers. They love the work that we do. I'm sure you've all had this experience. You sit on an airplane and so the person next to you asks what you do for a living. If you say you're an astronomer, people are just excited. They want to hear about what you do. And as a result, we're accustomed to giving information to people and having them readily accept it. But when it comes to climate science, it's more complicated than that. Now, another issue we have as scientists is that we're trained to be dispassionate about things, that we see ourselves as being separate from the issue. So here's a comic strip I saw some years ago, that we tend not to appreciate the severity of things or really put ourselves in the place of the people who are being impacted by things. And so there's an old joke about a bunch of physicists in a car driving towards a wall at high speed. And rather than applying the brakes, they're all calculating the time of impact and comparing their notes on when exactly they think that's going to happen. So as scientists, we need to move out of our comfort zone as just talking about science content and helping people understand the problem and the severity of it and what we can do about it. And so it's very important that we convey the urgency of the climate crisis. And I'm sure you've all heard sayings like this, that we have 12 years to save the Earth and that sort of thing. And while that's not really true, and that's not what scientists actually said, what was said in a study a couple of years ago is that what we do over the next decade is going to have profound consequences for climate change. The good news is that we're still in a position to avoid the worst consequences of climate change, but what we do in the next decade is really critical. And so it's very important that we help people understand what we need to do. And specifically what we need to do is drastically reduce our carbon emissions from the use of fossil fuels. We need to cut our emissions in about half over the next decade by 2030, and then go carbon neutral somewhere around 2050 to 2060. Now, how exactly we're going to do that is obviously a big question, but that's the urgency of the problem. We can no longer talk about this as a problem for future generations. The problem is here and now. Now, another issue with talking about climate change is that it's often portrayed as an environmental problem. And when you say the word environment, that connotes a lot of things, a lot of different things to different people. So for a lot of people, if you say this is an environmental issue, they think of polar bears or tree huggers. And so when we talk about climate change, we need to help people understand that it is more than an environmental problem. It's a health problem. It affects the temperatures in which we live. It affects the forest fires that are occurring, the smoke from those fires, the flooding. These are all health problems and food security issues. It's also an economic problem. The economic impacts of the flooding and the fires that are being caused, not just in the damage caused by those weather events, but also the lost economic output is a factor as well. So for example, Hurricane Harvey, which hit Houston, it's estimated it costs $125 billion in damage and economic loss opportunity. And perhaps most importantly, we need people to understand that it is a justice problem, that the people who are being most affected by climate change are the people who are already marginalized and already have the least resources to deal with the issue. In other words, the people who suffer the most are actually the people who are the least responsible. And so we need to help people understand that dynamic. So when I talk about climate change, I make a point of doing all three of these things. The first is to help people understand what's causing climate change, help people understand why we care about it, the consequences of it, and then finally talk about the solutions part. And I think this is really important. As scientists, we want to focus on the causes. We want to get into the science of what's happening with greenhouse gases and all that. And while that's important, we're really now at a point where most people want to know, what can we do? And when I first started teaching and talking about climate change, I didn't know how to do that very well. And I think I was giving the misconception that there's nothing we could do. And so that's a space that we need to be able to engage in. Also, when talking about climate change, it's important to know your audience. Who are you talking to about it? And when it comes to making decisions about climate change, most people make decisions based upon not on facts, but on their values. What is important to them? And this is something that as scientists, we're not accustomed to. We're accustomed to being able to tell people something and they'll process that knowledge and then they'll act based upon it. So in other words, for example, if you tell someone that loaf of bread is moldy and that mold is unhealthy to you, that would naturally lead to behavior where people would not eat the moldy bread. But in this case here, it's more complicated than that. So we need to help people understand how climate change affects the things that they care about. So when talking with people about climate change, it's important to consider these factors. Who is your audience? Who are the people you're talking to? Are they total strangers and maybe a public talk? Are these people in a class which you may already know or you may have a long-term relationship with them? Is this friends or family members? And finally, what is it that you can hope to achieve? Are you trying to convince someone who doesn't think climate change is a problem? Are you trying to convince them that it is? Or are you trying to convince someone who does care about climate change what they can do about it? So related to this, there's been quite a bit of research on how Americans feel about climate change. There's several groups that do this, including what's called the Yale Center for Climate Change Communication. And there's also a group at George Mason University. And these two groups have been doing a study called 6 Americas, where they have identified 6 distinct categories of Americans and their concerns about climate change, ranging from the most concerned, who they identify as alarmed, going down all the way to the doubtful and dismissive, people who are either skeptical that climate change is actually happening, or in the case of dismissive, people who think that it's all a hoax, it's a good grand conspiracy, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious to see what you think. Which of these 6 categories do you think has the most Americans in it? And you can go ahead and go to the chat and type in which of these 6 groups you think it is. I'm curious to see what you think. Okay, I'm seeing quite a few people who are saying disengaged or concerned. And that's actually what most people say. They think most people are somewhere in the middle. Let's see where they actually are. And I'll point out this is recent data. This is from last September. And believe it or not, most of the people are in the alarmed and concerned categories. In fact, over half of Americans are in those 2 categories. Notice that the disengaged category actually is the smallest category, and in large part because most Americans now have seen or experienced the consequences of climate change, whether it be flooding or fires or heat waves. And so there's actually not many people in that group. The group that does this study, they've been doing it for about 20 years now. And what has happened is over that time, people have moved from the middle, from the cautious and disengaged category, up to the alarmed and concerned category. So the majority of Americans are in those 2 categories. What's also interesting is that the doubtful and dismissive categories have pretty much stayed the same the entire time. In other words, those are people that have made up their minds and pretty much aren't going to budge. Now, it's sort of the Captain Ahab effect. We tend to focus on the doubtful and dismissive. We try to find strategies to try to convince our crazy uncle that climate change is actually real. But one of the things I'd like for you to take away from my talk is that we really need to focus on the people who are in the alarmed and concerned categories. These are the people who know that climate change is an issue, but they don't necessarily know how to get involved in addressing it. And so those are the people that I am focusing most of my attention on now to help them understand what we can do. Now, one of the issues we have in talking about science in general, but this is especially true for climate change, is that words have specific meaning, and those meanings might be different for scientists than they are for the public. And so just as an example, I'll give you this messaging. This is a quote I created that says simply, models indicate that if we don't reduce carbon emissions, by the year 2100, the global average temperature could increase by as much as 8 degrees Celsius. Now, I admit I created this as to be a really good example of bad communication. And there's at least 5 or 6 things in here that I think are bad from a communication standpoint. Not that the science is bad, the science is solid, but from a communication standpoint. So I'm curious to see what you think are the deficiencies or the problems with this communication. You can go ahead and type that into the chat, or you can unmute your microphone and say what you think. Okay, so Alan mentions models, 2100, 8 degrees Celsius. Ranga mentions too forward-looking, 2100 seems far away. Yeah, so what's wrong with the word models? What's wrong with that?
Most people don't understand that scientific models could be wrong, could be right. That is to say, most people think of scientific models as theories that don't have any solidity behind them.
Okay, yeah. Now, to go even further, to most people, this is what a model is. Okay, so for most people, if you start off talking about models, they're thinking, well, what does that have to do with anything? Some people will know what a computer model or a simulation is. And as you correctly pointed out, there's a lot of uncertain, there's a perception that those models are uncertain. How could we know what's going on so far in the future? And as several of you mentioned already, there's other issues here. One is the year 2100. What does that mean? I mean, that's way off in the future. Most people don't have the brain capacity or the wherewithal to think that far in the future. I don't think, I certainly don't as well. And so that's part of it too. And then the Celsius part, what is 8 degrees Celsius? Most people don't know what that means. And even if they did, there's still the issue of, well, so what? Is that an issue? Maybe people don't feel that way in Southern California, but I'll tell you here in Alaska, that actually kind of sounds nice if things warmed up a little bit here. So one of the biggest issues here is it doesn't really explain why we should care. Why is climate change a problem? Even if all this is true, even if this was going to happen, why should we care? So I'll mention some other examples of words that are often used in science communication, in particular with climate change, that often are interpreted differently by the public. So for example, aerosols. When we think of aerosols, we think of particulates in the atmosphere. But of course, to most people, an aerosol is something you spray on your hair. What is a positive feedback loop? Well, that sounds good. It has the word positive in it. So instead of saying positive feedback, we should use phrases like vicious cycle. And there's other examples as well. And recently I saw a press release about a climate scientist saying that she was really excited because they had this really awesome data set. And I know where she was coming from. She was trying to convey that this data set is high quality and it's going to be able to answer a lot of the questions they have. But for a lot of people, I think they'll hear that and think, oh, the data is good. That means things are better. Maybe it's not a problem. So we have to be mindful of how what we say might be interpreted. Another problem we have is we often use graphics like this. If you do a climate change talk, you almost certainly start with a plot like this one, which shows the temperature anomaly, how the temperature has changed over the last few years. And this is another example of a graphic that to us as scientists is pretty clear what it is saying, but for the public, there's a lot of confusion. So first off, what are all the different squiggly lines? Why are they squiggly? Why are there so many? And in particular, what is the temperature anomaly and why should I care? We tell people that the temperature has gone up 1 degree Celsius or about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, gee, that doesn't sound bad. The temperature went up 5 degrees from yesterday. So why is that an issue? So a good example of a communication strategy to help people understand why a 1 degree Celsius change is significant is to use the comparison to the human body. If your body temperature goes up by 1 degree Celsius or 2 degrees Fahrenheit, you're starting to run a mild fever. You're probably not feeling well. If it starts getting higher than that, then the consequences become more dire. And so that's an example of if you could do a comparison between the human body ecosystem and the Earth's ecosystem, you can help convey why even just a change of a few degrees can be significant in its impact. Here's an example of a graphic that I think is still problematic, but actually does things better. This shows the solar irradiance compared to the temperature of the Earth. And what I like about this graph is that it shows pretty clearly that as the temperature of the Earth has increased over the last 60 years, the sun has stayed pretty much flat or even slightly dimmed during that time. So this is a graphic that does a good job of conveying that the sun is not responsible for the Earth warming, which is a very common climate denier talking point. Now, next, I want to talk a little bit about what we can do to make things relevant. First off, don't talk about polar bears. Unless you're like me and you live in Alaska, if you talk about polar bears, it just conveys that this is a problem for somewhere else and somebody else and not themselves. So one of the most important things you can do is to understand how climate change is affecting you locally. And of course, sadly, in Southern California, there's no shortage of examples of that, right? And so if you can connect those experiences to climate change, then it'll help people understand why the problem is immediate and why they should care about it. So obviously the fires, the heat waves, the droughts, those are all climate enhanced phenomena. And so helping people understand that will increase their concern and willingness to address the problem. So whether it be heat waves, fires, droughts, etc. Finally, and this is something I mentioned earlier, it's very important for us to talk about solutions. When it comes to climate, talking about solutions, often scientists feel uncomfortable working in that space. We don't want to be advocates. We don't want to be seen as shills for a particular industry, whether that be like wind power or nuclear, something like that. But what we can do is we can be providers of information and we can be brokers of that information. So one of the things I love to do with my students is to share with them a resource called Project Drawdown. And the website is called drawdown.org, and I'll put it in the chat here. And what it is it's a wonderful resource that shares with people all the different solutions that we have for climate change. Now, unfortunately, when we talk about climate change, we often talk about it from a personal responsibility perspective. And there's often a lot of shaming that goes along with that. We have people use carbon calculators so they can determine what their footprint is. Now, these calculators can actually be useful for people to see where their emissions are coming from and to decide on changing behavior. But unfortunately, this messaging gives people the sense that it's their own responsibility, that rather than it being a systematic change that we need, it's individual changes in behavior. And it also tends to convey a message of austerity. That is, how can you use less? And that's not necessarily the solution that we're looking for. One of the things I like to do is to share examples of solutions, and in particular local solutions, because everyone likes the local story. And so, for example, here in Alaska, Kodiak Island has switched to 100% renewable energy. And in the process of doing that, they've actually reduced their electricity costs. They've stabilized the cost of energy. And as a result, the local economy has grown. And so it's a win-win scenario. It's an example of addressing climate change and growing the local economy. And so this is something that can be used to help people understand that in addressing climate change, we can actually do things that make our lives better. Another message that I think is important to convey to people is that what's happening right now is a natural and inevitable transition to new forms of energy. This plot right here shows the sources of energy that we've used in the United States from 1776 to the present. And one of the things I like to emphasize with people is that we've continuously have transitioned from one energy form to another. And each form of energy that we've used has been cleaner and cheaper than the source of energy prior to it. And so what we're doing now as we transition away from the use of fossil fuels to other sources of energy is the same process. These sources of energy are going to be cleaner and cheaper as well. Now, that's not to say they don't have their own problems, they don't have their own downside, but we are looking at solutions that we're going to want to do anyway. So what I'd like to do now is just talk a little bit about climate change and its impact on astronomy and things that we need to do in our community to address it as well. Now, I don't have to tell you guys at all anything about how climate change is impacting astronomy. The fires at Owens Valley and Mount Wilson are stark examples of how astronomy infrastructure is threatened by climate change. We also, of course, have the issue of changing climate conditions at our observatories. We choose remote locations in large part because we anticipate that the weather patterns there will remain stable for decades. And so weird things are starting to happen. So for example, in the Atacama Desert in Chile, it's raining in places where it never used to rain before. And so we have to ask ourselves, how is that going to impact our science operations? And finally, we also need to lead by example. There was a study that was published in Nature 2 weeks ago. You may have seen the news about this, where they did an assessment of the carbon emissions associated with the observatories that we use, ground-based and space-based. And they found that it's quite a significant footprint. And so sadly, astronomy does bear responsibility for the carbon emissions that we're producing. Now, obviously, these emissions are very small on the big picture of things. Certainly, we pale in comparison to things like cars or airplanes or even Bitcoin. But we, on a per person basis, we do have an unusually large footprint. And this is something that's very important for us to address, not only because we want to reduce our emissions, but also we want to serve as a good example. So this right here is a news story that was in a conservative newspaper in France a couple of years ago. And I don't speak French, but the headline translates, if I remember right, it translates to something about how the scientists who have the largest carbon footprint are climate scientists themselves. And this is important because if we try to tell other people that we need to do something about the climate crisis, but we ourselves are not doing anything, it's hard for people to take us seriously. And so we need to lead by example. We need to show that this is a priority and we are willing to address it. And finally, these changes need to be on the scale that's necessary. So not only do we know that carbon emissions from running our observatories, we also have carbon emissions associated with supercomputing, and then, of course, air travel. And in addressing these issues, though, I want to emphasize that we can do things that can reduce our carbon footprint and also address other existing problems within our profession. And I don't know about you guys, but I have really enjoyed not being on airplanes continuously for the last 2 years. I certainly miss in-person conferences and I miss visiting collaborators and traveling, but I really don't miss being on airplanes and I don't miss being in hotel rooms. And the last 2 years, because of COVID, has been a real wake up, I think, for a lot of us, including myself, as to how much time we waste dealing with just travel issues. You know, how am I going to get from point A to point B? Where's my hotel? Where's my rental car? Et cetera, et cetera. And so we can address a lot of issues that face us in astronomy by doing things differently. And the most obvious example of that is virtual meetings and conferences. And this is something we're all starting to do and obviously doing right now, right here on Zoom. And so, you know, there's a lot of interest right now especially in the AAS, to look at ways that we can reduce our air travel and reduce our carbon footprint. Now, this was a survey that was done not just of astronomers, but scientists at ETH Zurich, and asking them what their biggest concerns related to reducing their professional air travel. And the big ones are ones that you've probably have yourself, and you've heard many people talk about. Missing out at conferences, missing collaborations, missing the opportunity to learn about the sciences going on out there. And these are all real concerns, and these are things that we need to address when we incorporate more and more virtual conferencing and communication into how we do science. But one of the things I like to emphasize to people when it comes to talking about things like virtual conferencing is that we're not good at it. And the reason why is because it's new to us. And the example that I like to give, this was from a colleague of mine, is he said, in many ways, the way that we're doing virtual conferencing is like the way TV was done when television was first invented. When TV first came out, people didn't know how to do television shows, so they just did radio shows on TV. And eventually, over time, they learned about ways of incorporating the new technology and creating a new format for a way of entertainment and communication. And I think that's where we are with talking about virtual conferencing. And so one thing to keep in mind is that the way that we are communicating online right now, whether it be through Zoom or through virtual conferencing, is going to change dramatically over the next 10 years because there's this whole new economy that's growing around it, whole new ways of communicating. And I think what we're going to find is that what we consider a conference and what we do online is going to be very different than what it is now. And I just give this example just to show that over the span of a decade, how much technology can improve, and with that, allow us to do things that we haven't even thought of yet. So if you've had a bad experience in a conference online, just keep in mind that the experience you had is not the one that you're going to necessarily have in the future. So I'd like to wrap up by talking about things that you can do. And as an individual, perhaps the easiest and most important thing you can do is to simply talk about it. Teach it in your classes, talk about it with colleagues and friends and family. One of the biggest issues is that people are afraid to talk about climate change because they think that other people aren't concerned about it and it might become contentious. It might lead to a difficult conversation. Another thing you can do that's important, if you haven't done so already, is learn more about how climate change is affecting you locally and what are some of the solutions that we can do for that. Third, I'll mention is learning how to be an effective communicator about climate change is really important. My wife is a journalism professor, and I've learned a lot through her and other resources about effective communication strategies. And so those are things that we can do to help us to better reach people, help them understand the issue, and to be enthusiastic about addressing the problem. And then finally, as I said before, we can lead by example. What are things that you're willing to do to help other people understand the problem? Now, what are things that we can do collectively? Well, as an organization, the first thing that would help is to understand the carbon footprint of the activities that you do as an organization. And then that leads to the opportunity to create plans to reduce those emissions on the timescales called for in the Paris Agreement, specifically to cut emissions in half over the next decade and get to net carbon zero around 2050. Now, obviously, for a lot of that to happen, things have to happen outside of astronomy. We don't generate our own electricity for the most part. And so we have to, but we do need to be advocates for those solutions. Now, what are some obvious examples in astronomy? Well, some of these are things we do already. So things like remote observing or online tax or review panels or Zoom talks, these are all things that we're already incorporating into our workload that are making our science productive. And then finally, I'll just say advocate for green solutions where you have influence. If you're on committees at your institution or observatory or any groups that you may belong to, whether they be professional or personal, advocate for solutions that will help everyone to address the problem. Finally, I like to say that change can be scary, but change can be good. We often tend to focus on things that we're going to lose. When people talk about things like virtual conferencing or reducing air travel, we often think about the things that we're going to miss. And that's all something that we should be mindful of, but we also need to think about things that we can improve as a result of doing things in a different way. So for example, the American Astronomical Society, when it first held this conference online in June of 2020, they had double the participation. And so that was a real eye opener for a lot of people to see, there's a lot of people who are being excluded. And so making these changes are ways that may not only address climate change, but also reduce our carbon footprint. So finally, I think as scientists, we have an obligation to share with people what we know and the impacts that it will have. And so just like if you were walking down the street and you saw a child playing in the road, you would have an obligation to help that child. If you saw a building on fire, you would have an obligation to point that out. And so as scientists who understand the climate crisis issue, we have an obligation to help those around us. Finally, I'll mention, if you're interested in joining us, there is a group of astronomers, an informal organization called Astronomers for Planet Earth, and I'll share the link for that in the chat as well. And this is just an informal group of astronomers, over 1,000 of us, who are working to find ways to be better communicators and advocates for climate change. Absolutely free to join. We have an active Slack channel. If you're interested in that, we also share information and resources for teaching as well. So I hope you will consider joining us if you're not already a member. And finally, I'll include my email address here. I'll put that in the chat as well. And please don't be shy about reaching out to me if you have any questions or thoughts about climate change. I'm more than happy to share with you any of the resources or information that I have as well. Okay, I'll stop there, and I'll be more than happy to talk more about this. So if you have any questions you'd like to raise, please feel free to do so.
Awesome, thank you. I'll go ahead and clap for everyone.
Thank you.
That was great. Does it, yeah, I'll open it up to the audience. If anyone has questions, and feel free to unmute and ask it. All right. Well, I have one. I'll go ahead. Yeah, so at the beginning, you talked about how, yeah, as astronomers, we aren't really used to talking about controversial topics. Do you have advice for folks about that, and or kind of how you yourself got to talking more about it at public events and or different settings?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's important to understand the context and your audience. Are you having a one-on-one conversation with a friend or family member, or are you talking to an audience at a public talk, or are you battling someone on social media? Those are all going to be different places. So you need to be mindful not only of the relationship you have to the individual you might be talking with, but the other people in the audience. So for example, when I talk about climate change, like in a public talk, you often have someone who's a skeptic or a denier who has a question for you. And I'll just say briefly that the difference between a skeptic and a denier is a skeptic is someone who is genuinely skeptical. They're not yet sure or understanding the science, where a denier is someone who's entrenched themselves in the viewpoint that it's not happening, and there's basically no way of convincing them otherwise. And they've also, in many cases, done a lot of research on climate denier talking points, common arguments that are made to, try to show that climate change is not real. Now, I tend not to have one-on-one conversations with a climate denier because there's really not any point in it. But if I'm in an audience and someone brings up a climate denier talking point, it's helpful to be in a position to address it in a way that not only addresses the content of their question, but also helps the rest of the people around you feel like you've addressed it in a way that's respectful and considerate. And one of the resources I'll mention here, and I'll share this in the, I think it's skepticalscience.org, is there's a really great website called Skeptical Science, and they do a really good job of breaking down many of the common climate skeptic and denier talking points. But that said, don't feel like you need to be an expert in all of these, because really the argument is not being made on a science content basis. It's being made on a basis of cultural identity and values. And so often people who stand up to give climate denier standing points, what they're really trying to do is express their identity and their position. And usually I see the majority of people in the audience just roll their eyes and like, oh God, here we go again. Most people don't want to hear about that. What they do want to hear about, again, as I've said, are the consequences and the solutions. And so having a respectful conversation is really the best way to go forward. If you're talking with someone, whether it be as an individual or group, will that person leave the conversation feeling like you listened to them, that you were respectful, and that they were heard? If you just systematically shut down everything they say, then they're just going to feel insulted, as anyone would, right? If someone said, well, what about this? And you just simply said, no, you're wrong, you're going to feel like you were not treated respectfully. So a common strategy is to agree where you can, and then show where you disagree. So for example, the most common talking point is to say, well, the Earth's climate has always changed. And in fact, there's times when it's been hotter than it is now. And that's true. There are times when the Earth was hotter than it was now. But the key difference is one, we weren't there then, and neither were the plants and animals we rely on. But two, things can change naturally, but that doesn't mean that what's happening now is natural. Just like if you saw someone with a gunshot wound, you wouldn't say, oh, well, how do you know someone killed him? People die of natural causes all the time, right? It's obviously an unnatural cause. And so that's an example of where you can show someone where you agree with them, but then also show where you disagree. And you can do it in a respectful way that I think, even if they don't change their mind radically that day, if they may feel like they may soften their stance. They may feel like that you were a good person who tried to help them understand the issue. And overall, it was a good interaction.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, I think the difference between like a skeptic and a denier is like also a really good point to make. We have a question by Carl. Go ahead, Carl.
Hi, sorry, this is a bit off the cuff. I haven't even thought about this, but I just from that very narrow observatories use a lot of energy and how far out are the energy requirements of a typical modern observatory from what you could supply locally through renewable, wind or solar power? And has there been any talk of trying to make that, if not a requirement, then part of the budget for a new observatory?
That's a good question, and I think it really varies a lot from observatory to observatory. I do know that the NSF is planning to investigate how it can transition its facilities to greener energies. And really, I think it's going to vary quite a bit from location to location. I mean, the good news is for many locations, obviously for optical observing, we choose sites that have clear night skies. And so they have clear skies in the day as well. And so the potential for solar capacity can be quite good. Now, there is the issue of, if you're on a mountaintop, how much space do you have to put them? But I do know that the ELT is planning to use solar power as one of its sources, as its primary source of energy. I think that a couple weeks ago, I gave a talk in Noir Lab, and the impression I got there really is they want to make these changes. The question is, can they do so with support from the NSF and elsewhere that will allow them to continue to operate at the size capacity they have now. In other words, they don't want to divert resources to transitioning to green energies if that means closing facilities or making fewer instruments available or that sort of thing. So I don't have a simple answer for you, but the good news is that many observatories are looking into how they can do just that.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So I'll point out, Ranga mentions the white paper from 2010. It was called very cheekily low energy astrophysics, which I thought was cool. We actually submitted also a white paper for the 2020 decadal, and it was identified as one of the issues that needs to be addressed in new facilities. And so I think in the future, that is something that will be considered in the decision making when construction and operations are considered for the building of new and operations of existing facilities.
Ranga, go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, if I may ask a question, and don't you think the pace of change is too slow? I mean, we've known about this for now, some people have known about it for 40 years. Us, we've known about it for maybe 10, 15 years. That's enough time to bring about change in, at least at the facilities level. And although many of us have, at least at home, we have done what we can to be green. At the institutional level, it seems to me that change is too slow, despite whatever lip service governments provide. Are you frustrated by that? What do you think is the reason for that?
Yes, it is very frustrating. And, I think that for a long time now, it has felt like living in this bizarro world where we all know there's a serious problem and yet no one is addressing it. And I think a lot of that just comes from the sociology of crises. A good example is if you were in a theater and you saw smoke and flames off in a corner of the theater, off in the distance, you first would, of course, notice the smoke and flame. But if you looked at everyone else around you and it seemed like they weren't doing anything about it, then you might be inclined to think, well, maybe it's not what I think it is. Maybe there's not really a problem there. On the flip side, if you were in a theater where there was no smoke or flame, but everyone starts running for the doors, you're probably going to do the same thing as well. And it really reflects how, as individuals, we make our decisions. If everyone else is doing something, we have a tendency to do it as well. And it can be very hard. And I remember just personally, around this time 2 years ago, I went into a Costco and I was the only one wearing a mask. I happened to have a mask because we have volcanic eruptions here in Alaska and we just have masks for that. And I was the only one in there that had a mask. And it was really hard. It was hard to be in that space. People are looking at you and you feel weird and you just want to take it off because no one else is doing it. And I think that's kind of how we've been with climate change. We've known it's a problem and yet no one seems to be doing anything about it. So it's easy to forget about it. It's easy just to focus on our next observing proposal, our next grant, or how we're getting dinner that night, or how we're getting home. And because of the insidious nature of climate change, it's this crisis, but it's a long-term crisis and it's slow moving, that it's easy to let our brains just forget about it and move on. And so that's kind of a rambling answer to your question, but I think, and yes, and as Carl mentioned, there's a lot of pushback. And it's easy to forget that there is a lot of resources being put into convincing people this is either not a problem or it's a problem we can't solve and we shouldn't try to do anything. And the good news, though, is that people's mindsets are changing. And I'll just say for myself, I've been concerned about climate change for a long time. I live in Alaska. We're warming at 3 times the rate as the rest of the world. I have pictures of myself standing next to glaciers that don't exist anymore. There's a visitor center outside of Anchorage to look at a glacier, and you can't see it anymore from the visitor center. It's receded so much. So here in Alaska, we've experienced these things, and yet the rest of the world just seems to have thought it's not a big deal. And so, you know, yes, we should have moved a lot more quickly, but there's also a lot of forces at play that were trying to prevent us from doing that. And the good news, though, is we still can avoid the worst consequences. And I like using the analogy of, imagine a museum is on fire. And imagine there's a wing of the museum that it's been destroyed. All the artwork in it is gone. We're not getting it back. Well, we can just give up and say, well, it's hopeless. There's, you know, the fire's done its damage, but there's still the rest of the museum to save. And we really need to focus on doing what we can now as quickly as we can to save as much of the museum as we can, to minimize the consequences of the fire. And I think with climate change, we also need to be careful with how we talk about it, because we often talk about it as it either is or isn't going to happen. And climate change, of course, is not an asteroid that's either going to hit or not hit the Earth. It's a gradual problem. And, you know, stopping at 1.5 degrees is better than 2, but 2 is better than 2.2 or 2.5, and 2.5 is better than 2.6 and 2.7. So no matter how bad things get, it will always be worth us to do as much as we can. And so that is what I think we need to focus on now is yes, we should have started decades ago, but here's the situation we're in now. What can we do about it? And that was a very long-winded answer. I apologize for that.
Yeah, so I'll read out Carl's questions. What lessons did the AAS learn from the fully virtual meeting in 2021? And is the AAS working toward increasing and improving the hybrid meeting experience? Yeah,
so what have we learned? We've learned people like it. The attendance went way up. The primary reason was because of the costs associated with it. It's easy to forget that for many astronomers, travel budgets are few and far between. A surprisingly large percentage of AAS attendees are paying out of pocket. And so the difference between paying a couple $100s to attend virtually versus a couple $1,000s potentially to travel in person, that was the make or break. We also know there's a lot of people who can't attend meetings because it may be hard for them because of their business or family obligations. We know that early career astronomers, especially women, are the ones who are most impacted when it comes to travel related to in-person meetings. And we also know that there are people who have disabilities that make travel at conferences hard. So the good news is there's a lot of interest in it. But we also know there's a lot of downsides to it. The interpersonal communication, that spontaneous communication that we so much enjoy from the face-to-face meeting isn't there in the same way as it is. And we also know that poster sessions really don't work well at all in the online format. And I think these all reflect issues that have to do with the delivery method. As I said earlier, we're trying to do the in-person experience, but online, and that doesn't work very well. There's a lot of other experiences that work much better. And so there's new conference models. There's one called the nearly carbon neutral or NCN model, where a conference is spread out over several weeks. The talks are pre-recorded, and so you can watch the talk at your convenience, and you can submit questions, which will then be answered in a live Q&A session. And this gives people the flexibility to watch the talk when they want to, submit questions, and then the speakers can have the time to think about their answers. And so I think this is an example of how we can be addressing problems that we didn't even really appreciate existed. And that is that at a AAS meetings, the talks are very short and rapid fire and aren't conducive to a good conversation anyway. So that's an example of where I think when we think about the deficiencies of online conferences, we also need to think about the deficiencies of in-person meetings and what are the things we can do to address both. Louisa also mentioned booths don't work online. That is so true. I sat in a booth online for a whole day and 0 people came by. So I can totally relate to that.
Not sure how to get the NASA calendar also otherwise. My favorite part of the AAS.
Yeah, the swag, though I gotta say, over the Christmas break, my daughter and I went through her closet and just poured out buckets of swag that all is headed to a landfill. And so it was just a stark reminder that little trinket I brought home as an expression of love for my little girl is now forgotten and buried.
Maybe
So
no.
yeah.
All right. Any last quick questions before we wrap up? All right. If not, well, thank you so much for this really excellent talk, for spending the time with us.
Thank you. I want to thank you all for coming. I appreciate that you've made this a priority, and I hope that you will continue to make climate change a priority in the future. So kudos to you for taking the time. Thank you.
All right. Have a good one and see you all next time. Bye, everyone.